Welcome to this first of 3 tutorials on how to create a born again cardigan. My name is Martha and I have created a technique to replace parts of denim jackets with hand knitting. It's lots of fun, it doesn't take too long, and you can create something very, very unique in any size using any yarn at any gauge. So I have put together for you 3 tutorials. There are 3 steps to making a born again cardigan. The first is to determine your gauge and determine the exact size of the panels you're going to knit to replace in your jacket. The second tutorial is about knitting the pieces, and the third tutorial is about preparing your jacket and attaching the knitting to the denim. So this is tutorial number 1, determining your gauge and calculating your finished knitting size. There are complete detailed instructions in your PDF pattern. This page is starting page 7, and so I'll go through them with you, and you can follow along with your pattern if you like. So I recommend you use a machine washable yarn. You don't have to, but it's difficult to wash a denim jacket by hand because the cotton soaks up so much water and they're heavy. So you can easily use a machine washable yarn. You can wash your garment in the end in a garment bag on a gentle cycle with cool water and hang it up to dry once it's spun in the washing machine. So I recommend, as I said, a machine washable yarn. So the first step is that you need to knit a swatch. This is super important. I know every knitting pattern says to do that, but it's really important in this case because we're knitting pieces in the end that are an exact size because they have to fit the panels that you're replacing. So begin by knitting yourself a swatch. Here's my swatch for this green born again cardigan I'm making for my friend. This is called a broken rib pattern. It's a nice pattern, and it's the same on both sides, which is kind of nice. So here is my swatch, and you can see here in step number 2, determining my gauge. Oh, I'll pull that down a bit for you. So it's very simple. You know how to do this with a ruler. Count the number of rows, the number of stitches, and the number of rows. So in this particular swatch, I had 16 cast on stitches times 30 rows, which made a 4-inch square. And then I, of course, divide that by 4 to get the 1-inch dimension. So that is 4 cast on stitches over 8 rows creates 1-inch square. So that's pretty straightforward, and these figures are going to be important as we progress. So the next step then is to determine the finished size of our knitting. So the front and back panels, which are what we're going to replace on our born again cardigan. We need, of course, to determine exactly what to cast on and how many rows to knit. So on page 8 of your PDF pattern, here we go, is a little diagram of a denim jacket and exactly where you measure. So the back panel is easy. We're not going to worry about, on a denim jacket, especially a ladies one, sometimes there's a little bit of a shaping, but we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to knit a plain rectangle. So we're going to measure the width at the top, just below the yoke, and the length from where the yoke starts down to the bottom of the bottom band. So the finished width in this case, so that's this measurement here, is 11.5 inches. And we know from our previous calculation that we're going to cast on 4 stitches per inch. So our final calculation is 46 stitches to cast on. I'll just give you a warning. The Jade Dreams pattern that we're doing here is a moss stitch pattern, so you have to actually cast on an odd number of stitches. So in this case, I would cast on 47. The length of the back panel, again, from just under the yoke to the bottom of the waistband is 16.75 inches. Again, I know from my previous calculation in my gauge swatch that there are 8 rows per inch. We multiply that, and so we will knit 134 or thereabouts rows. So that's the back panel. The front panels, and here you can see the front of a jacket, we'll measure the width right at the widest point, which is the underarm, right up to the button panel. So right up against it. So again, this measurement here from the underarm to right up to where the button panel is, or the button placket, I guess is the right word. The finished width there is 10.75 inches. And we know again, we are casting on 4 stitches per inch. 10.75 is 43 stitches to cast on. The finished length, again, from under the yoke down to the bottom of the waist panel is 13.75 inches. Again, we know we are knitting 8 rows per inch as per our gauge, which comes to 110 rows to knit for the front panel. Now, because as you know, in the front panel of a denim jacket, it's not quite rectangular, so we need to decrease to allow for this. So that's the next step. And this is the armhole shaping. So you'll notice on this, on the worksheet here on page 9 of your PDF, I've got some calculations. So we want the distance between, we're drawing an imaginary line right underneath the arm, moving horizontally, and it will connect with another line, imaginary line, going vertically from where the arm meets the top of the yoke down to where the line meets there. So that's our line. So from this point here to this point here is A to B, and from this point here up to the yoke is B to C. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to calculate how many stitches we need to decrease over a certain number of rows, usually around 20 for an adult size jacket, so that we can get the nice armhole shaping that we will need. Because again, when we replace this part of the jacket, it needs to be pretty precise to the exact shape and size. So we know we are doing 4 stitches per inch. And we know when I measured this jacket here, the calculation from A to B was 3.25 inches. So 4 stitches times 3.25 inches is 13 stitches to decrease. And then we need to know, okay, we've got to decrease this amount of space. So over how many rows? So that is the next calculation. We know we have 8 rows per inch. And the calculation, the distance between B, can you see here? There we go. Between B and C is 2.5 inches. 8 rows times 2.5 inches equals 20 to decrease over 20 rows. So we know now we have to decrease 13 stitches over 20 rows. So here's an example. If we were to decrease 9 stitches over 15 rows, we would bind off 2 stitches at the beginning of row 1 and row 3, and then bind off 1 stitch at the beginning of every right side row 5 more times. So this would give us a decrease of 9 stitches over 13 rows. So you just have to kind of calculate it depending on your rows. I usually maybe, you're casting on at the beginning of the row, I might bind off 2 stitches at the beginning of the first, 2 stitches at the beginning of the third row, and then 1 every other row, 5, 7, 9, 11, whatever, until I get to the number of stitches bound off. So that will give you a, I'll show you here on my sample that I'm making for my friend. Here's what it'll look like at the end. It'll give you an edge where the casting off has happened. Now, one nice thing about the moss stitch, of course, like this broken rib stitch, it's the same on the front as the back. So really, you can make 2. You don't, if you were making, say, a Born Again cardigan in stocking stitch, which you could easily do, you would have to decrease on the right side of one panel and then on the wrong side of the other panel, so that you would get the two mirrored panels for the two sides of your jacket. But because the moss stitch is the same on the front and the back, you can do the same thing. You can start on the right side, whatever you determine the right side to be, and do exactly the same thing on both panels. So that makes it a little bit easier. So that is step 1, calculating your gauge, measuring your jacket, and determining the finished size of your knitting. The next tutorial will be about knitting your pieces, which is very straightforward. And then the tutorial after that, I will show you how to prepare the jacket and attach your knitted pieces to the jacket.